the polling in particular is really interesting because, both parties will be looking at that when they're trying to work out
Mm.
just how hard their policies are. And, the polling is actually very mixed. There was more confidence in Labour than the Tories, but even amongst Tory voters, there was a bit more confidence in the government's policies, but there wasn't necessarily an outright interest in um, going after immigration as the biggest concern. Given that we do have gaps in the economy at the moment and the economy is suffering, I think people are quite torn when they're sort of presented with the arguments. And I think it's interesting that Labour is outdoing the Tories in terms of the polling because I don't think many people really know what Labour's policy is on immigration. And I think when you're polling, for example, on the NHS, you know what everybody wants from it. When you're asking about confidence in the NHS, you want an NHS that works. With immigration and small boats, when you're polling, I'm not sure if people want the most effective policy or if actually they don't like what the Conservatives are putting forward. There is a very strong backlash from people like Justin Welby, a lot of people who just feel very uncomfortable about it, who might be saying they prefer Labour's policy because they don't really know what it is. I think there's a huge assumption here that everybody wants the most effective policy, whatever that may be, and the polling just doesn't necessarily show that.
I suppose also as well, Matthew, that actually Labour being ahead on some issues is just a reflection of the fact they are ahead in the polls. And so people assume, you think, well, that's what I trust because I'm going to vote for them.
I think what this shows is it's the final nail in the coffin of the Conservatives' hope for winning the next election, because what we've seen since 2019 is this lurch to the far right and real centrist Conservatives. Even the clues in the name. It's the Conservative Party historically was about preservation, keeping things ticking over, making small incremental changes. And one thing you knew when you were voting Conservative was that you would get low taxes and that they would be pretty tough on immigration. And those are two things now that we no longer can trust Conservatives on. And so in the end, it's not a Conservative Party. It's been hijacked by the far right, so that centrists are now turning to Labour, which is something you never thought you would see 20 years ago. When it was, of course, David Blunkett as Home Secretary, who, he was a tough Home Secretary, but it was under the Labour government, New Labour, that the immigration problem started. This has been going on since, I think, 1994 was the last year that net migration wasn't increasing. So it's a problem partly of Labour's making. So there is, to follow on from your item at the top of the show, isn't it ironic? It's ironic that we're going to have to vote Labour if we want to cut immigration.
I suppose the other risk, I suppose, from the Conservative perspective, is you get they're losing support to the left, to Labour, whether that's because of ideology or just the question of competence, while also risking losing them out to the right. So while we've been talking, you've got Migration Watch UK launching a petition to cut immigration. You've got Nigel Farage saying these figures are a total breach of trust between voters and this government. The population explosion continues. Our quality of life is declining, and all the government will do is give us more lives. So there's a risk that they went to the right by promising to clamp down on immigration, down to the tens of thousands, but then in breaking that promise, they lose to the left on competence and to the right on not who think could play. They haven't done the thing they were going to do, Matthew.
Because the truth of it is immigration should never have been made a political topic. It's global population movement. It's a global problem which every country is facing, and so it's a mistake to make promises that you can't then fulfil. And I'm afraid that's what both parties have done. It's in one of those unsolvable problems. But I was struck by Pauline Latham, who you interviewed earlier. Conservative, as you said, they've been in government for 13 years, and the first stat she drew, the first thing she mentioned when talking about immigration was illegal immigration. But if you actually look at the figures, over half of immigrants are students. And this is what we need to address. If we really want to get immigration down, we need to think about how funding for universities work, because at the moment, universities are reliant on international students coming in who are more than happy to pay £20,000 a year for tuition fees, which home students can't possibly afford. And so you've got this funding gap, if you like, which is being propped up by immigration.
And then we've also got the issue. The other issue we talked about is how students aren't getting their degrees marked because their lecturers are on strike because they aren't being paid enough, and then the universities say, well, we haven't got enough money. They'd have even less money if they had fewer international students. What a mess, Manvi.
Yeah, you do sort of start to get just a picture of, the infrastructure and the economy having all these massive holes in which at the moment are kind of being disguised because of immigration. And the moment you make immigration your aim, all of that becomes much more visible. And also it makes a lot of people think maybe you should be making things like universities policy or, economic growth your aim. I mean, I think it's interesting, one of Labour's policies that they announced yesterday was about making sure that there is this shortages list, which is how it allows sort of immigration in for certain professions where we feel there's a shortage in this country. And up until they pointed it out, I don't think most people realised that it also allowed employers to pay 20% less to people who were coming in to fill a job than they would to somebody who was here, which just sort of seems bonkers. I mean, it's exploitative, but also it's not great for the economy here. If we are trying to sort of provide jobs and make sure we're filling those gaps, we shouldn't have a way where you can just automatically offer less pay to somebody coming from outside. I mean, it's just all these little loopholes that you think have been around for an awfully long time, and it's just really odd that stuff like this hasn't. If immigration is your greatest concern, it's odd that stuff like that hasn't been looked at. So I think there is a real problem in terms of competence for the Conservatives on this. If you declare something to be your primary policy, if this is the thing you're saying you want to be tested on, you really need to make it work.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't seem to be happening.